Hey there, we can finally record 6K RAW with the Canon R6 Mark II. That's right, Atomos finally released firmware updates for their devices so we can do this. Now the Canon R6 Mark II was released in November of 2022, and one of the big selling features was the capability of recording external 6K ProRes RAW to the Atomos devices like the Ninja V, V+, and Shogun. Now, we weren't able to do this because there wasn't firmware yet available for those devices to be able to record the 6K RAW from the R6 Mark II, but the firmware was released today at the day of recording this. So what I want to do in this video is talk a little bit about the capabilities of this combination of the R6 Mark II with an Atomos Ninja V or V+ or Shogun. And then I'll show you a few examples and we'll take a look at those. And then I'll let you know if I think it's worth shooting in 6K RAW on the R6 Mark II. First thing is let's talk about what modes you can record with the R6 Mark II. So keep in mind we're talking ProRes RAW here, not ProRes, so different codec obviously. So you can shoot 6K ProRes RAW up to 30 frames per second on all the devices, so the Ninja V, V+, and Shogun. And you can shoot up to 6K 60 frames per second RAW if you use the Shogun or the Ninja V+. Now the website is kind of weird because it says you can shoot in 6000 by 3374 at a ratio of 1.9 to 1, which technically isn't correct because if you do the division of 6000 divided by 3374, you get 1.778, which is actually the same as 16 by 9. And this actually makes sense because the R6 Mark II doesn't shoot in DCI or a 17 by 9 ratio, it only shoots in UHD, which is 16 by 9. You can also shoot in a 3.7K crop mode in ProRes RAW, up to 60 frames per second for all the different monitors. Now this is a little bit weird. Why do we not see 4K here? Why do we see 3.7K? Well, we do have that 1.6 times crop when you're shooting crop mode, but it makes me wonder about the 4K that's in the camera on its own, like if shooting an IPB internally. Is that an up-res from 3.7 to 4K? Not really sure, but I don't know. I just want to point that out as well. Now there is one other mode in here which is listed as 6000 by 2496, 2.41 to 1 cinemascope ratio, and it says crop for WFM active on the Shogun and Ninja V+. I assume that means waveform active. I just couldn't figure out how to get this to work, but I guess you can shoot a 6K cinemascope ratio somehow. But maybe you guys can figure it out. As of right now, maybe it's coming in an update or something like that, but I couldn't figure it out. So to get started with all this, you got to make sure, of course, you update the firmware in your device. So go to Atomos' website and download the firmware for the device that you have, either the V, V+, or Shogun. As of right now, it's version 10.90. So make sure you first format the SSD inside the Atomos device, then take it out, plug it into your computer, copy that file that you downloaded into the root directory of the SSD, put that in the Atomos, and then turn it on and it'll automatically update itself. Also, you need to make sure you have the ProRes RAW enabled. So you have to do that if you don't have that already done. You need to register your product. You need to download a token and put it on the SSD and it's a whole thing, but make sure you have that set up as well. So now let's take a look at what's going on in the camera. So let me show you how to set this up inside the camera. So first of all, press the menu button, and then we're gonna go over to the 8th tab under the camera section to where it says HDMI RAW output, and we are going to turn that on. This is what enables this to work. Going back to the first tab to look at the resolutions, so under movie recording size, if we click on this, there are two different options. We'll talk about both of these, but the main one that we're interested in is gonna be the first one, the HDMI output. So if we click on this, there are 3 different options, and it's interesting because over here it says 6K, and on the options down here it says 4K, but either way, this is what we're looking for. This is the 6K RAW output. So you have 3 options. You have 6K 24, 6K 30, and 6K 60. So we'll leave it on 6K 24 for now. Now the second option here is interesting. This is to record either a backup or a proxy. And if you see the number 2 there, that's because this is only going to record to the second SD card slot. So it won't record to the first one. So make sure your card is in the second one. It's ready to go. And for this, you have 2 different options. In Full HD or 1080p, you can record an IPB or IPB Lite. So it's nice that you have an option to record a backup. Now going back out of here, you can also turn into crop mode, go into movie cropping and enabling that. And if you go back to the movie recording size, there are different options in here. So if we go under HDMI, you can see you now have the 3.7K like we were talking about before. And again, you can have the 3.7K 24, 30, and 60. So those are your different options there. So let's take it out of movie cropping mode. Okay, now if we back out of here, if you see at the bottom of the screen here, we have a couple things going on. It says HDMI RAW and C-Log 3. So it will record C-Log 3 to the SD card if you're running a backup, but of course it's going to do HDMI RAW output, and you can also see the RAW symbol over here too. So we're ready to go inside the camera. So now let's take a look at the monitor and see what's going on in here. So If we go under input here, you can see that we're recording in 6K 24, so that's cool. And if we go to record, we have a few different options. Of course, we're trying to record in ProRes RAW, but you can also record in DNX, H.265, or ProRes, but we're going to do ProRes RAW. And then for compression, you have ProRes RAW and ProRes RAW HQ. I don't even want to think about ProRes RAW HQ because ProRes RAW is big enough. And you can see it's recording 6K 24, so we are good to go. One other thing I want to point out here is that if you have the camera set up to not export in RAW, it'll show you on the screen. So you can either turn that off in the camera, or even if when you press the menu button, you'll be able to see here, there's a little symbol that says not RAW input. So you can make sure that it's working properly when you're looking at the monitor. Now, when you bring this footage into your computer, it's going to import it, of course, as ProRes RAW, and you have to decide what log curve to apply. So, of course, I think the best option for this would be to apply C-Log2 and then go in and do your grading and everything else. All right, so how's the footage? Well, now we know how to set it up and use it. Let's take a look at some images. Now, I've been super curious about this ever since I got this camera and shot in C-Log3 and wondered if there's more dynamic range that you can get out of the sensor when you're shooting in RAW. So like usual, when I'm taking a look at dynamic range, I do a simple test where I stand in a dark room next to a bright window to sort of look into the shadows. And the way I do this is I expose the highlights as high as I can without clipping them. And then I take a look at the shadows and see what's going on. And I tested all the different modes, but I'm not going to show you them all here because they were all pretty similar, but I'll show you a few. And so first of all, we'll take a look at the 6K RAW 24 versus the 4K 24. It comes out of the camera in IPB. And out of the camera, just ungraded, the RAW has lower highlights and lifted shadows. There's less contrast, and you can definitely see this in the image and also in the waveforms. And so after grading is where it gets a little bit more interesting. What I noticed here is the shadows are very messy on the 6K RAW. Now, I expected there to be more noise with RAW like there usually is, but this is really messy. And I think that the 4K IPB definitely looks better in the shadows in terms of the color, and I didn't really notice much difference in terms of the information in the shadows. One thing I do want to point out here is in the highlights. They definitely look better on the RAW, and if you look through the window, you can see in the sky and in the railing that the highlights look a lot better on the 6K RAW. So as I said, I got very similar performance in the other frame rates, but I just want to show you a few so you can see them. So I compared the 6K RAW 60 with the 4K 60, and as I said, it got very similar performance to the 24 frames per second, both looking at the image straight out of the camera and also with the graded image. I think there's pretty much the same performance in 60 frames per second as there is in 24 frames per second. I also tested this, as I said, in the other modes, but let's take a look here at the 3.7K RAW 24 frames per second, which is a crop mode, against the 4K crop mode right out of camera. And again, I had similar results to the 24 and 60 frames per second in the full frame modes. So from these results, I do not see any advantage here for shadow information with the 6K RAW over the 4K internal recording. All right, so let's take a look at an outdoor example where I am not stretching out the image so much and really pushing the dynamic range. We can take a look at the highlight performance and also the overall colors and just the general image quality and stuff like that. So in this example here, I'll compare the 6K RAW 24 frames per second with the 4K 24 out of the camera. And as I said earlier with the indoor test, I got very similar results with this too. So we'll just take a look at this example. So ungraded out of the camera, like it was inside, the RAW has lower highlights and lifted shadows. There's less contrast, and you can also see this in the waveforms of these two images. Now after grading, I got them to look very, very similar, and I have to say there's probably just a slight advantage for the highlights on the 6K RAW, and you can see this on the road. There's a little bit better highlight roll-off, a little more information in the highlights, but overall, the images were very, very similar because when you're recording in 4K internally in the camera, you are taking a 6K oversampled 4K, and this is in a 4K timeline. So if you're spitting out 6K and then putting in a 4K timeline or oversampling 6K to 4K in the camera, you get very similar results in terms of detail and sharpness in a 4K timeline. So I wanted to double check everything by doing a controlled latitude test, or what's known as a push-pull test here in the studio. So taking a look here at the overexposure test, I think they perform pretty similarly up through 3 stops overexposed, but once you hit 4 stops, you start to see an advantage for the RAW in terms of the highlights, and you can definitely see this at 5 stops overexposed. Now on to the underexposure test, and this is what I'm most interested in checking out. I think they both start to fall apart a little bit at 2 stops underexposed, and once you get below 2 stops, you start to see a little bit of difference in the color. I think that the RAW might hold on to the color a little bit better, but in terms of the noise, they're both pretty messy, and I don't know, it's personal preference here, but I think there's a little bit more color information with the RAW than the internal recording. So overall, from my limited initial testing here, I do not see an advantage of shooting RAW on the R6 Mark II. So what's going on here? Well, I've tested the dynamic range of the R6 Mark II versus the R7, and the R7 had more dynamic range, but it was pretty close. I've also tested the dynamic range of the R6 Mark II versus the R5, and the R5 definitely had more dynamic range. I've noticed that the R6 Mark II was always weak in the shadows, and I made a video about how to properly expose C-Log3 in the R6 Mark II, and I found out that it was best to overexpose it by about 1 to 1 1/3 stops because of the shadow performance in this camera. So if you're interested in checking out that video, I recommend doing that. I'll put a link in the description. So the image quality of the 6K RAW could be a limitation of the sensor, but it could also be how the R6 Mark II and the Ninja V or V Plus talk to each other, how the ProRes RAW processing happens, etc. But overall, I'm not really impressed with the 6K RAW, dynamic range, and image quality. And from this, I have to conclude that the dynamic range of the R6 Mark II is really not limited by C-Log3 like I thought of before I got to test the 6K RAW, but it just has less dynamic range than the other newer cameras like the R7, the R5, the R5C, the R3, etc. All right, so I just wanted to share what I've seen so far with my limited initial testing because I know a lot of you out there have been curious about this, and myself included, and a lot of you have been asking me to test this since this camera came out. Now, I know the firmware just came out, so I'll be curious to see how other people do with this, and maybe the results are different, but I just want to share, as I said, what I got in my initial testing. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider hitting subscribe down below. It would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.